Thank you for joining us. We are here tonight with Rabbi David Kasher, eye for an eye for an eye. That's not a mistake. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The Poetics of Jewish Law. Very much looking forward to this with all of you. And I know Rabbi Kasher very well, but I'm going to read a formal bio anyways, because it's always nice to see some connections you may have with him from some of his past. Rabbi David Kasher serves as the director of Hadar West Coast. He grew up bouncing back and forth between Berkeley and Brooklyn, hippies and Hassidim, and has been trying to synthesize these two worlds ever since. Very true. After graduating from Wesleyan University in 1998, he studied for several years in yeshivot in Israel before heading off to rabbinical school at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. He was ordained there in 2007 and returned to Northern California, where he became the Senior Jewish Educator at Berkeley Hillel. He was part of the founding team at Kevah, a nonprofit specializing in adult Jewish education. He served on the faculty of Berkeley Law, the Wexner Heritage Program, Reboot, and the BINA Secular Yeshiva, and also taught courses at Pardes, SVARA, Hartman Institute, AJR, and HUC. Rabbi Kasher is a teacher of nearly all forms of classical Jewish literature, but his greatest passion is Torah commentary, and he spent 5 years producing the weekly ParshaNut blog and podcast exploring the riches of the genre. In 2018, he began work as an associate rabbi at Ikar, a non-denominational spiritual community in LA, where he teaches a weekly Parsha class and has a new Parsha podcast called Best Book Ever. He published an essay, Eating Our Way from Justice to Holiness, in Kashrut and Jewish Food Ethics, published in 2019 by someone, completed a translation of Avot Rabbi Natan for SVARA, and is the author of ParshaNut, 54 Journeys into the World of Torah Commentary. We do have the book available up front, if you hopefully noticed that, if you don't have it already. And you can also join his weekly class. I know Stan attends on Thursdays, and his weekly Parsha podcast you can tap into very easily. What's it called again?
Well, it's the Best Book Ever is the podcast.
The Best Book Ever, right.
But if you, there's a QR code on the back of your pages or a website on the front, and you can find my weekly Bar Torah there.
Beautiful. So eye for an eye for an eye, the Poetics of Jewish Law. If you don't have a handout, please raise your hand. We'll get you one. Otherwise, we're looking good. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi David Kasher.
I'm here in the merit of being very good friends with Rabbi Shmuley, and we've been in a kind of Torah dialogue now for 2 decades. So nice to be able to learn with you, Rav Shmuley, and nice to be able to learn with you all. I started my journey in Jewish learning, as I think a lot of folks who go off to yeshiva do, and that is to say, I started it with law. I studied the law. That was the primary focus of my studies for a long time, for all kinds of reasons. One is that I wanted to know what to do, how to do this Judaism thing. Like I was in my early 20s when I got really fired up, and so I was making up for lost time, and I just wanted the instructions. And I studied law because I wanted to know what to do. But I also studied law as a matter of tradition. That is to say, we study in yeshiva, we study the Talmud, and the Talmud is made up of, they say, around 2/3 legal material. It's mostly a legal conversation. And so you're studying the Talmud, and so you study law. In fact, the tradition goes as far as to say that you should publish your first book in a matter of law before you're, so presumptuous as to start giving your interpretations of the stories of the Torah. In other words, like, get your belly full with the meat and potatoes of Jewish life, and then you can talk about like the fun stories of the Bible. In fact, you don't read a whole lot of Bible in yeshiva, which is kind of a funny thing. You don't actually end up reading the Torah that much. You study the Talmud all the time. So there's this way in which the law is really privileged. It's sort of taken the place of pride in Jewish intellectual life. But I was fine with that for a while, and as you heard, I also eventually went off to law school. I did that after my yeshiva studies, and that was also an exciting form of study to me. This sort of comparative lens, looking at Jewish law once again now through the through the framing of a secular legal system. I spent a lot of time with the law, but eventually those stories are so good that I got kind of swept away, and the focus of my studies and my teaching and my whole life really has become a study in literature, I would say. The literature of the Torah, the literature of the Hebrew Bible, the literature of the Talmud and Midrash as well. The stories, and now I'll use a term of art, the Agadah in our tradition. And our tradition is sometimes divided in this way. We speak of halacha and Agadah, the law, and then the narrative. And Agadah is like Haggadah, like the stories that we tell, like on Passover when we tell a story. So, there came a point where I began to focus more and more on the stories of the Torah and really to fall in love with the literature of our tradition. I was just talking to Rav Shmuley today and saying that, when we were in yeshiva, there was all these like theological debates of what you had to believe, and was the Torah from God, and what did it happen then, and who delivered the Torah to us, and and if you didn't believe that, then you're on the historical, critical, academic side of things. But I was saying to Shmuley, back then those debates seemed so important to me. But after years of studying the Torah, it's like it no longer matters to me. It so clearly sparkles with divinity. This literature, this book that we have is just so good. It's just such good storytelling that that's sort of become enough of a kind of testament to its divinity for me, which is all to say that I moved from the study of law to the study of literature, and then eventually started to think about what it might be like to turn back and look at the law now through the lens of literature, through the lens of a reader of stories, through the eye of a reader of stories, and to think about the law not as an entirely separate genre. Like, stories are fun and for entertainment, and maybe there's like some kind of moral that you take away from the story, and law is about what you do, and the first one's fun to read and the second one's not, and the first one's sort of irrelevant to your life and the second one is relevant to your life. It's a very sharp binary that we could make. But it turns out that the law is in the Torah, and therefore it is aware of itself as part of as fitting into a literary tradition. And the more that you study the law through that lens, the more you begin to see that there is a kind of literary style that the law of the Torah has as well. What I'm calling tonight the poetics of the law, so that we could study the law through the tools of literary analysis, the same tools we might use to read a poem and to think about like the precise words chosen in the poem and repetition and stylistic choices that the law makes. And we're going to do that tonight. And it's a good week to do it because, as I also said in that room over there, this is the week when we, in the cycle of reading the Torah, we take a big pivot and start thinking about law all the time. There has been law before this. Last week was the 10 Commandments after all, but this week is the legal code. They sometimes call it the covenant code because it comes right on the heels of the standing on Mount Sinai and forging a covenant. And now and it's so exciting, and you've encountered God, and it's glorious, and and then all of a sudden it's like, you wake up the next morning and it's like, okay, here are 50 laws for you to start following. And it's case after case after case after case. And actually it's because there's a word for this, and I'm never sure if I pronounce it right, but it's casuistic. It's case law. Mostly, like, what happens if your ox runs into my cow? Who's responsible? And the laws are not just thou shalt not kill, but in a situation where you are in a conflict with someone else, you should make sure not to kill them, or something like. There's a case that's being laid out, and because the case is laid out, there are these little stories kind of embedded in the law. There are these little scenarios embedded in the law, and so there's an opportunity there to to start looking at the stories in the law. But we're going to go, tonight, even our magnifying glass is going to go even closer, because the laws that we're going to look at tonight don't even have necessarily a story baked into them. We're going to look tonight at one of the most famous laws in the Torah, one of the most famous lines in the Torah, and you saw it at the top of the hour, and that is the law of an eye for an eye. Okay, ayin tachat ayin in Hebrew, an eye for an eye. Now, we're going to take a look at this and try to not just understand what it's saying, but to have a feel for the poetry of this law. And when I say the poetry of an eye for an eye, that may sound a little funny, except that the phrase itself is a little poetic, in that there's already a kind of repetition, a kind of rhythmic, and you may know that it isn't just an eye for an eye, but it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a leg for a leg. We'll soon see this. So there is a kind of like rhythm to it. Already we can start to feel that the law is being delivered with some sense of style or syncopation. Okay, that much is obvious. But what I want to do tonight is really start to take a look at the law as it appears in the Torah and start to read very, very closely, not just that one line, but the whole context that the law appears in. And as it turns out, we have a lot of work to do, because that law, an eye for an eye, appears not in one, not in two, but in three contexts in the Torah. And we're going to take a look at them all. So that's the eye for an eye for an eye. There are three. But let's begin. But before we look at the actual text, I want to just ask you, what do you think, before we start analyzing, of the law, an eye for an eye? What are your associations with that law? Good law, bad law? Does that give you good, positive feelings, or otherwise? I don't want to tip the deck too heavily here.
I always thought that it was a way to contain retribution or violence. That I accidentally killed your oxen. You can't wage war and kill my whole family. I always thought it was a leveling law.
Good. This is really important with Ginny, right? Yeah. What Ginny's saying, which is that an eye for an eye can be thought of as granting you power to do just that much to another person. As much as was done to you, you can do to another person. But the way Ginny's putting it is that the law may also be setting a limit. You can do no more than what was done to you. Same law, but a different emphasis in there. And that would be to curtail a kind of, a disproportionate response. What Anne was just saying is that this law of an eye for an eye, it doesn't do anybody any good. Well, how does it make your life any better that you're able now to harm this other person? And Anne asked the question rhetorically, as if to say, I don't see the utility, the value, the merit of this law. All it does is cause more pain. That's not justice, Anne says. That's vengeance. And indeed, the notion of vengeance is right at the heart of this law. In fact, this law is so famous, there's a nice fancy Latin word for it, lex talionis, right? Which talion is like retaliating. So lex, the law of retaliating. So that's what this is about, is you're being able to strike back, to retaliate, to seek vengeance. Now, what's so bad about that? Anne doesn't like that. Well, what's wrong with vengeance? So maybe this law is meant to communicate some kind of some system of value, of evaluation for us, an awakening, a sort of a clarification of what's at stake. But I think I hear you saying, Rav Shmuley, but not to be carried out exactly as it is, as it seems. Because as it seems, how does it work as it seems? An eye for an eye? And there are societies who practiced it. An eye for an eye means if you gouge my eye out, then I'm coming with my spoon and I'm coming for one of yours. That's the way it works, and I have a right to. Now, I just want to, we're going to look at this inside in just a second, but Anne's point is important, and I obviously agree a little bit with Anne. I know what Anne is saying, but there's a part of me that wants to push back and say, what's wrong with a little vengeance? Is that what's wrong with vengeance? Maybe there is something wrong, but can we articulate it? Anne seems to say it doesn't do any good. Well, why not? It makes me feel good. I'm outraged and I want to strike back.
Vengeance could be a deterrent.
Okay. So it is possible to look at an eye for an eye as not just a vengeance a vengeance code, but a way of deterring future eye gougers. You see what happens.
Yeah, if I can poke out your eye and write you a check, and I can poke out your eye and write you a check, as long as I've got money, I can keep poking out eyes. But if
That's good.
If you're gonna come back to me that literally, I might think again.
Okay, I want you to remember that formulation because that's really interesting. The way that the rich man could abuse this law, because that sort of thinking is precisely the sort of thinking that our rabbis are going to bring to this case in sort of the other direction. What role does financial compensation have to play, and as opposed to physical retaliation? We'll get right there, but I think what you're suggesting is maybe the law is setting up a sort of a scale of equivalencies that will be good for, Reb Shmuley suggested it would be good for me to know what's at stake. And you're suggesting, what's your name? Steve is suggesting that it's good for the judges to know how to think about what has been lost. What is the value of? So we're setting sort of equivalencies in terms of this will help the judges. And as Steve puts it, rule how much is owed in this case. And again, we're starting to talk about money and we've almost arrived at the first major rabbinic response to this case, but we'll see it in just a second. We're going to take 2 more comments. Yeah. Okay, good. That's right. It seems like the law, as I said, there's not really a case involved. It's an eye for an eye. That is the law. It's like a formula rather than if this should happen, then it's like, yeah, it's just a way of saying anything that you lose, you get to take back from someone else, or not take back because you get to do to someone else. Okay, good. We're soon going to provide a little context here. That's precisely what we're going to do. But you're right. In isolation, we're just talking about some principle of retaliation, some principle of tit for tat. Okay, one more thought before we dive in.
You ask what the problem is with vengeance.
Yeah.
I would say, what's wrong with it is maybe there's gratification in the moment, like you're angry and you get to physically act out that anger in this case, but it doesn't actually heal anything. It doesn't heal any relationship. It doesn't restore anything. Nothing about the victim in this circumstance is change other than maybe a short-term emotional outlet that causes more harm. Yeah. So it doesn't actually, it doesn't restore anything, it doesn't heal anything. And my bet is the gratification of being incredibly fleeting.
Yeah, good. Okay, so Rabbi Emily says that the problem with vengeance is that it doesn't restore anything, it doesn't heal anything. You're still left with the same. And I think that the rabbi means this in a kind of a big way, like the idea of vengeance and retaliation as a guiding principle is only going to cause more destruction and not actually solve the social conflicts that you might be embroiled in. But in this case, the point is made obvious, which is that I'm not going to get my eye back. It doesn't matter how many eyes I gouge out, I'm not going to get my eye back. So that, if we think of it as, well, how will I get my due? Well, I'm definitely not going to be compensated with sight. So something has not been healed or rectified. Will it really be enough for me just to feel like you suffered as well? And that is, after all, at base, that's the sentiment that underlies vengeance. I feel this way. You should feel that way also, so that there is an equivalency. So at least we're even in suffering. Good. So Rav Shmuley's searching for at least some conceptual justification for the principle of vengeance, and suggests that maybe the justification is that it allows for a kind of venting of trauma and rage that otherwise would stay bottled up and continue to create antagonism generation after generation. Maybe it is important for there to be a kind of every action has an opposite reaction, and trying to justify. But we have to do that work, and the fact that it's all couched within a caveat, it's interesting because clearly vengeance was an acceptable value in ancient society. Vengeance has a role that if we're shifting away from an affection for, admiration for vengeance, then there's got to be some reason why we have left that. And maybe it's because we came to learn as a human society that it doesn't heal wounds. Maybe we've kind of we've seen the folly of vengeance, but vengeance isn't so far in the distant past. People are still taking vengeance. So is it a low-level human emotion, or is there potentially some value or virtue to it? This law seems to suggest that there is. Okay, let's take a look at the law itself, and we're going to look eventually at 3 instances of law, but this is the first one. This is the one that we get in this week's Torah reading, Parshat Mishpatim. This is, in a certain sense, the classic, okay? So let's read it so that we have the language in front of us. And remember, we're going to be reading with a literary eye, so the language will be important here. I'm going to ask Matt to read it in English for me, and then I'll read in the. You can just hear like the listing there, like they're trying to think, what else can I put on there? A burn, right? All right, so listen to it in Hebrew, because especially at the end, you can really hear the poetics of it. V'chi natzu anashim, v'nagfu isha hara, v'yatzu yeladeha. V'lo ya'ason anosh ya'anesh kasher yasit alav bal ha'isha v'natan b'flilin v'im ason yiyeh v'natata nefesh tachat nefesh ein tachat ein, that's the eye for an eye, ein tachat ein, shein tachat shein, yad tachat yad, regel tachat regel, kviya tachat kviya, petza tachat petza, chabura tachat chabura. Okay. All right, that's the list. That's the first big eye for an eye list, and it isn't just an eye for an eye, right? There's tooth for a tooth. When I was just reading up on this, and apparently Donald Trump said last year that his favorite verse in the Bible was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's what he said. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So there's the tooth as well. And that was his favorite. This is an interesting case. The first part of this case is an interesting case in and of itself, because it contains the sort of first kernels of what will develop into abortion law in Jewish tradition. This is not an abortion, but it's relevant to abortion law, which is not our subject tonight, and it is relevant because in this case the fetus is treated as property rather than a life. That becomes like a relevant consideration. But for our purposes, it's not so relevant, because whatever will happen to the fetus happens to the fetus. She miscarries. But if she's okay, right? The guy smashes in. 2 men are fighting. That's the way it starts. And this is talk about case law. They're fighting, and then they careen into to one of their wives who is pregnant, and hit her so hard that she loses the baby, the fetus. Okay. Now, something's got to be done to account for that lost fetus. But if she's okay, that's all you're thinking about is the compensation for the fetus. But if she is not okay, if she gets injured, well, then what's the law? A life for a life. And that's where we start. Nefesh tachat nefesh. If she dies, you die. Now that is not like, I want to take that and just hold it in its own category, a life for a life. Because I suspect that there may be some people here who feel like an eye for an eye is barbaric, but a life for a life, maybe that does make some sense, or is that barbaric too? We could answer in different ways, but I think it's worth separating that out. We, after all, still have a notion of capital punishment in this country. We aren't taking people's limbs or eyes off, so we've made some sort of separation. Okay, but this is the list. And we talked about it a little bit. Why is it there? What's the principle? If you lose the fetus, you have to pay money. What happens if you hurt a person? Yeah, you get to hurt them back. The contrast is interesting.
Well, that's there because there's no way, if 2 men are fighting, there's no other fetus to go take. Oh, that's interesting. It's almost like the context suggests, like, well, there are some cases you simply can't go collecting the same thing where your wife's not pregnant, but there are some cases where it's clear what's to be done. You chopped off my arm, I'm going to chop off your arm. Yeah, okay, so let's think about that. If the baby is lost or the fetus is lost, you
you have to pay a fine, a fee, the value of that fetus. But if it's a person, you actually do harm to their, or if it's a fully grown person, you do harm to their body. So we have a contrast. Like from the start, we see there are different ways to solve problems. Why didn't they just go the same way with the woman? Let's just pay for her damages. There's some kind of separation being made between the problem of the fetus and the problem of a person. This is good. This is a really important point. What's your name? The point that Mark is making, that this is, we're talking about, and you can see it here, like family units. And we're speaking in like a time of patriarchy where there's like a head of a family unit who is responsible for all of the damage that might happen to his family, right? So you can hear it in here. If the woman loses a tooth, well then, the guy it sounds like her husband has a right to go smash the guy's tooth in, like as if it's not just what's been done to me will be done to you, but what's been done to my people, I can do to you. And that's important to think about, because then we get into questions of honor killing and revenge killing, and my tribe having suffered an injury or a death, and me going out not just because I've lost an eye, but because my people, my family, my team have lost an eye. We're like tapping a little bit into that mentality of you go out and you avenge the family, not just yourself, but the family. So that's important. And as we talk about this patriarchal society, let's just take note of the fact of where this starts. A woman is injured. Her fetus is lost. But it all started with two men fighting. Okay? These two patriarchs fighting, but damage ensues. And now the one patriarch is going to come to the other patriarch and say, hey, wait, you went too far, even though we were fighting. Right, but this damage I can collect for you. So that system of sort of family networks is important for thinking about what we're looking at here. Yeah, Stan. That's right. And this is, I don't know, you know the terms better than I do, but this is not a homicide, right? Like this is some kind of when you say collateral damage, it wasn't intended, like some kind of manslaughter here. So the idea that you might lose your life. You lose a tooth, you lose a hand, you lose a foot, you might even lose your life for accidentally killing someone. The stakes are very high here. Yeah. You know?
So the idea comes later in the Bible in terms of sanctuary cities.
Yeah.
Because they recognized that even if they didn't have the term of manslaughter, they understood there were negligent killings that were not deliberate and whatever. Yeah. So that itself modifies this idea of a life force. Yeah,
that's right. And I actually I think that's a great point, that there is another system of fleeing in order to escape punishment if you've accidentally killed someone. Like how that would work for accidentally poking someone's eye out. I'm not I'm not like, it doesn't cover those cases, but it is interesting to think about what I can't think about what if someone else knows maybe, but the distinction between a case you could flee from and one in which you would have to pay with your life, but maybe it has something to do with intention. Okay, all right, we have now the law in front of us. We have an eye for an eye, and let's say what else we got. We got a life, an eye, a tooth, a hand, a foot, a burn, a wound, and a bruise. All of those things can, and we could wonder, this is with our legal lens, not our literary lens, why those things? Is that list exhaustive? Are they categories? We could wonder these things. But as I said, what I want to do tonight is instead to look for some of the stylistic choices and patterns and repetitions that we see as the story moves, or as the law moves across the Torah. Before we do, though, there's one, but we're mostly just going to be in the Torah tonight, just the text of the Torah and looking at its literary merits. But there is one thing that we have to see before we get there. And actually, Ginny just saw it in her Daf Yomi, which is the rabbi's response to this law, which is very famous. When I say the rabbis, I mean the guys who brought you the Talmud, the rabbis, capital R. the people of the rabbinic period who spent their time turning biblical law into halacha, into practice. And they had a very famous response to an eye for an eye. Now, and I just want to say it's a famous response, and it's a striking one because it sort of flies in the face of what has become sort of the reputation of Jewish law, of Old Testament law. Eye for an eye. It's not, we didn't just pick a law at random. This is like the classic, the very embodiment of what the Old Testament is all about to some people. It's all about savage, heavy, severe, vengeful. It's a vengeful God, and you're a vengeful people, and everybody's savagely taking whatever they can violently from one another. That's like, what is it, the bumper sticker? An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. You've seen that bumper sticker? Oh, like there's that sentiment of like, what good is this really doing? This is like the worst of what our tradition has to offer. And yet our actual tradition, the rabbis who came and to look at the Torah and offer their interpretation, they had a very different reading of an eye for an eye. Anybody know what their reading was? We'll soon see it inside. Ginny knows, but anyone else know? Justice. I wish it was justice. It's money. That's right. No, it's money. The answer is money. The answer is, well, let's take a look. Okay. I'm going to have Ginny read it for us, and then I'll read it in the Aramaic.
Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says an eye for an eye refers to paying money for damages. But you say, maybe it means money, but maybe it actually means putting out an eye. What then would we do when a blind person puts out someone's eye, or when a handless person cuts off someone's hand, or when an amputee broke someone's leg? How would I apply an eye for an eye in such a case? Remember that the Torah says in Leviticus 24, you shall have one law for everyone, meaning that the law must be able to apply equally to everyone.
Okay. All right.
Could you get, but then what if the person has no money? So then it's not applying equally to anyone everywhere.
Well, okay, let's formulate. What's the law here? I said I would read it, so I will. I won't read them all, but I said it. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai omer, ayin tachat ayin, mamon ata omer. Mamon o einu ela ayin mamash. Hare, shahaya suma v'simeh, kitea v'kiteh, chiger v'chiger. Heichani mekayem bazeh ayin tachat ayin. VaHaTorah amra mishpat achat yeh lechem, mishpat hashaveh lekulchem. Okay, so so you can't do an eye for an eye literally, and I want, if nothing else, us to hear that our rabbis of the 3rd and 4th century are basically having the same kind of like uncomfortable conversation. We're like, what are you really? You don't mean really gouge the eye out. It's just to hear their incredulity is in itself an important piece of Torah. But instead you pay. That's the answer. Instead you pay the amount. Now, how you get to the amount is another question for us. But what's the logic? Why do you pay instead of gouging? No, that's not the reason. I agree that it is more humane, but that's not the reason they give. That would have been a good reason. Come on, you're not really going to go gouge someone's eye. What are you, a monster, a barbarian? That's not the reason they give. Yeah, Dave. That's right.
No.
That's right. Wait, but you want to challenge that?
No. That's
the way money is a common denominator. Yeah. Everyone can pay. That's half of the equation. Everyone will be, if we make it a monetary fine. Fine is not the right word. What's the right word? Penalty, correct? Then it'll be something that everyone can do. And that's, first of all, even as I say that, I'm wondering, is that something like our legal system is often like much easier to navigate if you have a lot of money. So like, does everybody have money to pay for an eye? So this is an interesting argument that we could problematize in that way, but we're still missing half of the argument. Anyone can pay, but not everyone can. It's what you said earlier. It's exactly what you said earlier, right? Which is that if you're blind and you go gouging someone's eye out, well, then they're not going to be able to take vengeance on you, right? If you're if you're an amputee and you cut off someone else's leg, well, too bad for them. I mean, maybe unless it was the right and the left, I mean, it's like, too bad, because you just happen to be someone who's immune from the penalty of the law, just by circumstance. And the rabbis say that's unfathomable. That's unthinkable. It's not just unthinkable, it's a contradiction with another principle we have. So that it's not just that they're saying, like, come on, be reasonable. They're saying the Torah has to make sense, and it won't make sense this way because we have another principle in the Torah. What's the other principle that we have to uphold? One law applies to everybody. So this law couldn't apply to blind people. So it can't be literal. There's only one way to make one law apply, but we already problematized this. There's only one way to make a law apply to everyone, which is to use a common unit of transference, currency, money. It has to be money because otherwise it wouldn't work out. Okay? So that's the rabbis' argument. So for all of the the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, the rabbis were like, eye for an eye, never heard of it. You just pay the money back. That's what this means. Now,
Question.
yeah.
Before the rabbinic period, when they're writing the Talmud, how did the Jews interpret this?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question. In other words, the rabbis, again, I'm speaking of a class, not like, me and Shmuley, but like a class of folks in the ancient, late ancient Israelite society. The rabbis presented themselves as the legitimate bearers of the tradition. So when they say it doesn't really mean an eye, it means money, they are claiming that that's what Moshe said to the elders back in the day, and it's been passed along, and that's what the rabbis, that's sort of what they are, is they are presenting themselves as the carriers of the oral tradition. And the oral tradition is the tradition through which we know how to interpret the Torah. It's not all obvious. And in this case, maybe it seemed obvious, but we've got traditions about how we read these things. The rabbis are sort of presenting themselves as the bearer of those traditions. Now, I think that question brings us immediately into, a kind of secondary suspicious question, which is, wait a minute, though. Do I believe, is this really what Moses meant? Is this really what the Torah meant? Could the Torah really have meant an eye for an eye? But what it means is you should financially compensate each other an eye for an eye? I mean, do you buy it? What do you think of this argument? What do you think of this argument that it couldn't be applied the other way? It has to be that we translate the law into money.
In modern times, we also translate the law into the amount of time you're going to serve in jail for what you did.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's right. That's interesting. In other words, in modern times, we also translate the penalty, not always in terms of financial, how much you will pay, but in terms of time, how much time you will serve in order to pay off, and what do we say, your debt to society. That's a kind of a vengeance model, or at least like a retribution model. You owe something now, and so you've got to pay it off. You don't have money, so you'll pay it off with time, with life. Now, again, there's now we've got a third unit that we could wonder about. Like, is that doing anybody any good to have someone sit in prison? Or maybe it is. Maybe the person needs to be taught a lesson, or maybe this is another way to think about paying off a debt. Yeah.
I think also they had the rabbis who say 2nd or 3rd century, they still had decades or hundreds of years of which observation also took place and conversation had to take place. And in looking at that, what was fair? So this guy was taking the eye for the eye. This guy maybe found a way to do something in exchange that extracted the justice in some way. And the rabbis or whomever the judges were at that time found that maybe that was fair.
Yeah.
But somebody ultimately, here, the rabbis in this comment, wrote it down and said, but here's the better way.
Okay. All right. So now this is an interesting way to think about reading the Torah, which is to say that the Torah presents us with a standard. And I don't know, are we to take it literally? Perhaps it was once taken literally. Perhaps, it's hard to know how to understand it, but the Torah presents us with a principle, a standard. And the principle is, if you harm someone, you must make recompense. Now, what does that mean? Well, maybe in your narration, maybe for a while they tried the actual physical retribution, but it just made for a bad society, and they tried other things, and eventually they found an interpretation. They developed a a social convention that was some kind of interpretation of the Torah's law, but was a version of it that people could live with, right? That's certainly one way to think about it. And you could do that with a kind of sociological historical sensibility. Like, this is the way that real law, there's what the Bible says, but then there's real, or you could do it with a theological sensibility and say, God gives us the ideal principle, but we play it out differently on this earth. We are left to interpret the ideal principle. In fact, one of the great Italian commentators, the Sforno, Evadio Sforno, says approximately that really you by rights, you should have your eye taken out. That's what the Torah is here to tell you, is that, like, this is what should happen, but, and I think someone suggested something like this earlier. This is what should happen, but we're going to take care of it through a financial transaction. So just so you know, I think this is actually Rav Shmuley's point, which is just so you know what you really ought to be paying here is with your life, but we'll let you pay it off, okay? So that would be a sort of a theological version of, but either way you look at it, maybe it's a kind of, it's an evolution of how this law plays out. Yeah, that's right. And that I was thinking about that when you were suggesting that you would serve your time, that often people ended up, one of the strangest things about, this is a bit of an aside, but one of the strangest things about biblical law, especially here in Parshat Mishpatim, is that for all of the liberation of the slaves, the first law regulates the proper terms of a Hebrew slave. Which is like, so you're like, what? So you still have slaves? Didn't we do away with that? But it does seem that in the ancient world, slavery was not just ubiquitous, but the idea that they had was that it could be made into a humane institution if it was more like indentured servitude and less like slave chattel. And the reason that I'm saying that is because slavery existed often because people would sell themselves into slavery, having no other choice, and owing a debt would be one way that someone might end up in servitude, a limited servitude. But yeah, that's an aside, but it relates. The answer is that they certainly did take those things into account, and I'm a little bit stuck here because this is a point I feel like I should have ironed out beforehand, because this is a little bit of a strange middle case where they are intentionally fighting, but the damage is not intentional. I'm not sure whether it fits into an intentional or unintentional crime, but it does make a difference. And those cities of refuge that we talked about earlier are specifically for, it's hard to imagine there were this many instances, but specifically for those who accidentally killed someone. And by the way, in those cases, the law is if they don't go to the city of refuge, the next of kin has a right to kill them in the streets, right? Which is to say, the principle of vengeance, it's out there, but I'm glad we're talking about this, because this is another way of thinking about how that principle gets negotiated. You can see even in the Torah, there's this institution to say, well, if someone didn't mean to do it, the principle of vengeance is still out there, but maybe we can come up with an alternative mechanism here. So yes, the answer is these things are taken into account. I'm not sure exactly how it plays out here. Okay, I want to move us a little bit forward because I want to make sure that so far we've just set everything up, and now I want to do some of that, what I'm calling literary study of the law here. And we're going to go one back and two forward, okay? In other words, what we're going to do is we're going to look for parallel cases, or even, because we're not using our legal lens, but our literary lens, we're going to look for a parallel language. Where do we see echoes of this language, this very striking language, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a wound for a wound, a bruise for a bruise. We're going to see one instance where we had like the first traces of that language before, and then we're going to see a couple of instances. As I said, this case of an eye for an eye comes up 3 times, so we're going to see a couple after. The one before. This is, I must say, not my connection, and I want to give credit to Rabbi Shai Held, who I work with, who made this connection, and very, very brilliant connection. But it's very brilliant, but somebody in this group has already basically suggested something similar. So let's see if we can extract the principle here. But most of all, what I want you to try to identify is like, where's the parallel? Where's the echo, the kind of the literary kind of repetition of phrasing here that we're going to try and make meaning of. So we're going all the way back to Genesis chapter 4, like way back, and we're looking at just a snippet of conversation, not a major character, a guy named Lamech, and Lamech was one of the descendants of Cain. Okay, Cain who killed Abel. That's the important fact that you need to know about him. Other than that, you won't need to know much. He will tell you a little bit about his life, and he will not tell you. He will tell his 2 wives. That's what we know about Lamech. He was a descendant of Cain, and he had 2 wives. Okay, let's see what Lamech has to say for himself. He has a story. That last line I'll explain a little bit. Cain has a mark on his forehead, and God says, if anyone attacks Cain, they will be avenged 7-fold. And so if Cain's 7-fold, then me, I take my revenge 77-fold. So okay, the details, what if its backstory is a little strange, but let's first of all just say, like, do we see the parallel? Do we see the language parallel? It's like wounds and bruises. Those are not common words, and certainly not common in that. And you can see that Lamech is speaking in a kind of poetic style. Oh, wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. This hazena, that's like listen to, like give ear. That's classic poetic language in the Torah. Moshe starts his most famous poem, Hazinu, right? Give ear. So this is a little bit of poetry, and so he's using one word and then a parallel word and being stylistic himself. But you've seen the 2 words. I'm gonna show you cases that are even more parallel, but I am convinced by the kind of echo here that there's a wound and a bruise here, and that we're hearing about wound for wound and bruise for bruise many years later. There's some kind of callback. Now, let's think for a moment what Lamech is saying. What is Lamech's story that he's telling his wife? Don't mess with me. Don't mess with me. Why? Why? What do I do? I kill people for what? For wounding me. And a child for bruising me. Lamech is a real savage. But what's his basic principle? If you do something to me, you're going to get 77 times what you did. You're going to get 77 times. You're going to see so much vengeance, not an eye for an eye, 77 eyes for an eye, right? Okay? If you so much as bruise me, you will die. Okay. Now an eye for an eye comes along and says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a leg for a leg, a bruise for a bruise, a wound for a wound. How are these 2 cases in dialogue with one another? Back to Ginny's point. Exactly right. Exactly right. This is the Rabbi Held extracted this principle from this connection, and I think Ginny intuited it as well, that if the callback is to the scene of Lamech saying, for a bruise I will kill you, then an eye for an eye is here to say you can't do that. There is a vengeance is a principle we recognize, but there is a maximum. And it's an eye for an eye. It's not 2 times or 3 times, or it's certainly not 77 times. It's an equivalency. You cannot take more than what you suffered. Okay? So these 2 cases, just as we begin to read the language of the stories together, these 2 cases suggest that once upon a time there was a world in which vengeance, I'm going to kill your whole family is what I'm going to do. You mess with, 1 tooth is missing of mine and you're all gone. And the law is actually here to say, now I'm not saying, oh, good, now we like the law, right? We've already problematized the law. But if Ginny's right, if Rabbi Held is right, if this connection is right, then the law is a restrictive rather than a permissive measure. It's setting a limit rather than allowing for. Okay?
It's only an eye for an eye.
Only an eye for an eye. Only an eye for an eye. Now, I don't know, that move, if that's the move, that feels like a move in the right direction. I don't know if it satisfies us, but you have like the first instances, inkling of where this law might be coming from. Yeah. Okay. So let me just repeat for the Zoomers. David raises the principle that we are familiar with, that the punishment should fit the crime. And if you use that as an overarching principle, not an eye for an eye, but there should be some, there's something a little vague even about the phrase, but the punishment should fit. It should be the right punishment for the crime. And we all have a sense of, well, the punishment doesn't fit the crime, that we have a sense of disproportionate punishment. So can't we just use that principle? And then we could have money and we could have time served. We have lots of different versions of, we can have an arrangement that but there's something that fits the crime. Now the answer is we do have that principle in Jewish law, and it's not just in Jewish law, it's Shakespearean. The phrase in Jewish law is midah k'neged midah, measure for measure, measure for measure. And that is a principle which applies all the time in God's punishments, this is a principle that we assume to be operative in a just system of law, that one gets measure for measure. As one does, so one receives. Now that measure for measure does not always mean that you get the exact same thing that happened to you, but that there is an equivalency. There's like, in as much as you, well, what's an example of it? Okay. One example of measure for measure. In the book of Kings, the city of Jerusalem is being sieged or sacked or attacked, besieged, thank you, by Ben-Hadad. And thank you. And Elisha, the prophet, says, and the price in the markets have gone up. And nobody can afford anything in the market because there's very little supplies coming in. And Elisha says, by tomorrow, I guarantee you that the prices in the market are going to be rock bottom because there'll be a victory tomorrow and all of the food supplies will flood in. And Roman official there mocks Elisha and says, what are you, your God's going to rain down bread from the heavens? And the next day, of course, Elisha's right, and there's a stampede for food in the marketplace, and that official, that soldier, that centurion or whatever, is trampled in the marketplace. Now, that is considered a case of measure for measure. It's named the measure for measure. Just as you mocked the possibility of God delivering food, so you will be killed in the marketplace where the food is consumed. Now, that's not exactly the same thing, but it's measure for measure. So yes, the answer is yes. And we have to wonder why then instead we seem to be talking much more specifically, not measure for measure, but tit for tat. That's in general a good question, because there is a person does have to pay back what they've stolen, but there's also a penalty on that. There's a penalty for stealing that gets added onto, a fifth gets added onto. Right. No, but it is so you're right to say that it's monetary there. Though it's not exactly the amount, there's some penalty for it. Wouldn't work as a rule if we made stealing not legal. That's not what I'm really about. The only consequence to stealing is you just have to pay it back. Then you just steal until you get caught and then you pay it back. I mean, that is there has to be a little bit of a consequence for stealing, right? And that's part of how that gets worked out. Now, your question is very to the point, because we're soon going to see that kind of thinking enter into our eye for an eye conversation. The question of well, what if it's not a human life? What then? So just hold for 1 second. I think I wouldn't dare try to offer, al regel achas, as they say, on one foot, some direct application of these laws to thinking about that stuff. But I do think that this kind of thinking makes us better trained to think through and to take stock of all kinds of damage in the world. So I think this is good thinking to be doing at a time like this, but I'm not the one to tell you how to play it all out. Okay. Leviticus. We're going to move quickly away from that question to Leviticus. No, it's an important question, and obviously these questions of revenge and proportionality, these are, we have to process this stuff. Absolutely, we should be thinking about this stuff. I'm not expert enough to be weighing in. Okay, so let's take a look now at the next case of an eye for an eye, and I wanted to show you the case, and you can see down at the bottom I bolded. Just if you look at the last verse, a fracture for a fracture, an eye for an eye. Eye for an eye is famous because it appears in all three situations, but you can see the language is a little different now. You have a fracture for a fracture, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. Just as he gave injury to a human being, so it shall be given to him. Okay, that seems like, yeah, that's what we've been talking about. That's fair enough. Okay, what I want to do now is go back and just read the story that this law comes on the heels of. Because as we start to read, the law as literature, we want to think about juxtaposition. We want to think about context. Where does this appear? We already had this law. Why is it suddenly coming up again? And we're going to try to look for what do we see that's the same and what do we see that's different. And it turns out that this law comes just right on the heels of a very strange case that seems to have nothing to do with an eye for an eye. So I guess I will read since we're worried about the Zoom here. Okay. There came out among the Israelites a man whose mother was Israelite and whose father was Egyptian. And they were fighting in the camp between the son, or maybe there was fighting. I think I translated it. And there was fighting in the camp between the son of an Israelite woman and a certain Israelite man. The son of the Israelite woman pronounced the name, meaning God's name, in blasphemy. In Hebrew, it's Veikalel, and cursed it. Pronounced the name and cursed it. And he was brought to Moses. Now, his mother's name was Shlomit, daughter of Dibri, of the tribe of Dan. Remember, his mother is an Israelite. And he was placed in custody until the decision of the Eternal should be made clear to them. And the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, take the blasphemer outside the camp and let all who are within hearing lay their hands upon his head and let the community leadership stone him. There's another one we don't do anymore. And to the Israelite people speak thus, anyone who blasphemes God shall bear the guilt, and one who also pronounces the name of the Eternal shall be put to death. The community leadership shall stone that person, stranger or citizen, having thus pronounced the name, shall be put to death. Okay. Now, it's very harsh and not a law that we apply this way anymore. But on the other hand, one of the 10 commandments, okay? Like using the name of God uselessly or for bad purpose. If any party kills any human being, that person shall be put to death. One who kills a beast shall pay for it, a life for a life. If any party gives injury to his fellow, what he did shall be done to him in return. A fracture for a fracture, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, just as he gave injury to a human being, so it shall be given to him. Okay. So what is that? Wow. Okay. There's an eye for an eye again. Why did I take you through that whole story about the guy who had the Israelite mother? Okay. Let's just this comes out of nowhere. So let's try to figure out where we are in the Torah. What has just happened? And in particular, I want to kind of leading question a little bit. What do we see here that's similar to what we saw before? They were fighting. There's two men fighting again. Okay, that's interesting. And in fact, the language of fighting, if you go back to the first page, is v'chi yinatsu anashim. When two men quarrel or fight, and look now back at the language in Leviticus, v'yetze ben isha Israelit, and there came out among the Israelites a man whose mother was Israelite, v'hu ben ish Mitzri, his father was Egyptian, b'toch b'nei Israel, and they were in Israel, v'yinatsu b'machaneh. And they fought in the camp. They quarreled in the camp. That is the exact same word, yinatsu, in our case of an eye for an eye back in Exodus. And it's the exact same, and the same word appears in Leviticus. And those are the only two places in the Torah where that word appears, yinatsu. Now, that is to introduce us a bit to the Torah's literary technique. That is a classic move that the Torah makes, is to connect two scenes with similar language that's not just the similar language of the case itself, because that's just repetition, but another signal word that is meant to tell you, no, there's more than one replication here. And so we start to think about these two cases in dialogue with one another, because it isn't just an eye for an eye here and an eye for an eye there, but an eye for an eye in both places on the heels of two men fighting. Okay. Now, what's that got to do with it? Why? It's such a strong linking word. It's not a common word. There are other words for fighting, but it appears 2 times, once before an eye for an eye in Exodus and once before an eye for an eye in Leviticus. And that is like almost like the Torah saying, you know, when we need to talk about an eye for an eye, when 2 men start fighting. Specifically in that case, when 2 men start fighting, we need to start thinking about an eye for an eye. Now, the question is, why? Why do we need to start? What does that have to do? Why is the context so similar? It's different, obviously, very different. We'll talk about that soon. But why? Any sense of what that might have to do or speak to our case of an eye for an eye?
There's going to be trouble. I'm sorry.
There's going to be trouble because when 2 men start fighting, there's trouble. Yeah, I mean, I do want to think a little bit about the gendered element here. Is it different when 2 male, you know, what we talk about now, toxic masculinity? The 2 men fighting, is it different than 2 women fighting? And it's like the certain kind of energy that we start to worry about when 2 men are fighting. Let me see if I understand you correctly, because I almost want to. I feel like I'm not sure if you're saying it or if I want to hear it in what you're saying. That it's almost like the law is asking us to think about what might happen when 2 men are fighting, which is allowed. The Torah is not going to say no fighting. That's too much. But this is the Torah's way of saying, as we all feel when we see a couple people start breaking out in fisticuffs, like this is bad. This is not good. Nobody's happy. Nobody wants. This is just a bad. And the Torah, this is like the Torah's sort of way of saying, you know what happens when 2 men start fighting, right? I think I hear that, like that link that is being made. I don't know if I'm misrepresenting you. Yeah. We wondered about that before, and I wonder if this might help us think about the question of different circumstances where maybe the penalty would be different. You'd be asked to flee, you go to a city of refuge. Like, are there certain circumstances in which we might handle it differently? But an eye for an eye is the kind of law that you bring out when you have a brawl, a fight, a sort of like chaotic eruption of violence, not like between states and not like a jealous rage killing, but just that sort of like it happens at a bar, it happens in the street, and like it's just chaos. And then someone loses an eye. What are we going to do? And there has to be some way of it's savage, but okay, these are the terms for this situation. So I think that's something to think about. Look, this takes us back to the conversation that Matt and I were just having. It's like maybe this is meant as a deterrence, right? As a discouraging you to get into a situation where you would have to employ the law of an eye for an eye. Yeah. Okay. So that context is important. It's just to think about. And again, this isn't a legal amendment. Oh, at any time when 2 men are fighting, it's, as I said, it's more of a literary association. Like, oh, again, the exact same language to describe fighting, and then we're going to start talking about an eye for an eye. So we do start doing that. Think, well, maybe we're thinking about certain cases, certain human situations. Okay. All right, that's what is similar. Now, there's a lot that's different about this case, not to mention, I mean, of all things, I couldn't help but think of this when I was preparing this class. God isn't an eye for an eye here. It's like the guy curses God's name. God doesn't curse his name back, right? God says he's going to die. So like, there's an irony there. Like, and I want to take it seriously. I mean, it's a little funny, but I want to take it seriously. Like somehow it's not an eye for an eye when it comes to cursing God. There are things you can do that it's like, no, that's it. Like you have crossed the line. It's not just measure for measure and proportionality. And yet, there are circumstances where it is an eye for an eye, and like, is this the human donation? Okay, so that's one point. I don't know what to make of it, but I have to mention it. But I want to get a little bit more into the weeds of the actual language here of an eye for an eye, and not just an eye for an eye. But where do we start? One who kills a beast, and there's the first phrase that repeats itself: nefesh tachat nefesh, a life for a life. So good, that sounds like what we heard before, but it can't mean the same thing here. Right.
And there wasn't even a beast in the story. So we're like, where did that even come from?
Where that even come from? You were talking about before about like, well, what do we think about like animals and what would we do if you injured an animal? Now, what is the penalty if you kill an animal? You die, right? Nefesh tachat nefesh, life for a life. If you kill an animal, you die. I'm reading it wrong. All right, what's the real reading? If you kill an animal, you
Pay for it.
pay for it. It says that. It says that. You pay a life for a life. Just look at that language again. If any party, one who kills, now, if anyone kills a human being, you die. Right? So just listen to the contrast here. There's like, curse God, you die. Kill a human being, you die. Kill an animal, you pay for it. Now, this is the first time that we've had this language, and it's been insinuated that maybe actually you would get off by paying for it. Not dying, because what do you die for because you killed someone's dog? Maybe, but no, you pay for it. You pay for it. Okay. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, that could be.
That'd be how you're paying for it.
That would be how yeah. But that doesn't seem to be the case here because it specifically says you will pay a life for a life. And yeah, it's a good question. Would you give a dog to pay for it? I mean, I suppose you would give a dog and then the dog has a monetary value. The person could do what they want, but it is not the case. I happen to just, this much Jewish law I do know, it is not the case that your dog dies when you kill someone's dog. Like it does, I mean, it sounds a little funny, but it's the right way the right question to ask here. Couldn't you just substitute a dead dog for a dead dog? But no, you pay for it. Now, this is important because this is really, we heard a little echo before of like wound, and maybe the law is addressing that earlier regime of unlimited vengeance. But here we've brought back that same language of a life for a life. But now, and it's on the heels of two men fighting, so there's something very similar happening. But now there's a difference, which is there is a possibility in this world of creating injury and making up for it that you might pay for something instead of actually gouging or killing or cutting off. And then the law continues. If any party gives injury to his fellow, what he did shall be done to him in return. A fracture for a fracture, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Just as he gave injury to a human being, so it shall be given to him. Now, is that the same law that we saw before?
This one does not say pay as an option.
No.
Doesn't say pay as an option. Yeah, it doesn't say pay as an option. So maybe what we're seeing is, yeah, when it comes to animals, we're going to play it out a little differently, even though I'm giving you the same language. When it comes to humans, just as you always thought. But it's interesting that we've now just got this insertion of a new idea, that maybe a life for a life could be made up through a payment. That's sort of, and as you said, it doesn't really fit the scenario. None of this fits the scenario, except that we have two men fighting. So we're in that sphere of activity. And then we bring up this law as we brought it up before, but we insert a couple of other details that may get us thinking about different ways to address a life for a life. This is a very, to bring out this kind of case and then just sort of breeze past the details is very irresponsible teaching on my part. It's a very, very difficult, painful, complicated case, which deserves a whole class to itself. But just to give a snippet of, so I appreciate you surfacing it because it shouldn't be just unsaid. The dilemma in this case is that the membership in the people of Israel is determined by the mother. The membership in a tribe is determined by the father. So this guy doesn't have anywhere to go in the camp. He doesn't actually, by the laws of ancient Israel, he doesn't actually have a tribe. And so he is, I don't know why were they fighting? But that's what the Midrash says. The Midrash says he was like looking around. Where do I, it's really heartbreaking, and it's just, he has no place. And finally he curses God. And I mean, there's a lot to say in this story. The back history that the rabbis write for this case is so painful and so heartbreaking. It gives you a sense that they too were troubled by this situation, but for another time. Speaking of another time, we have just enough time for one last case. Now, where have we been? We saw an eye for an eye, thought about it a little bit. We saw the rabbi's response to it, which was to convert it into a monetary payment. Then we went backwards for a minute and saw why the law might have come as a check on unlimited vengeance. And now we're seeing the law repeated again in a sort of, I don't want to say in a similar context, but sort of juxtaposed to a similar context. And we've got a couple of contrast cases. Seems like when you do something to God, you can be more than measure for measured. But it seems like when you do something to an animal, there's a different way of paying for it. So the law is like, not changing, but sort of we're inserting new points of data, new information. Okay. Then when we get to the final case, we're kind of set up for, again, very similar language, but a kind of different reality, a different set of circumstances. So we're going to read this one more case. Now we're in the book of Deuteronomy. And those are like, there's the three big legal books in the Torah. Genesis is almost all story. And with Numbers, it's kind of back to story. And Exodus is half story, but then starts this week with laws. Leviticus is almost all law, and so is Deuteronomy. Okay, so here's the laws of Deuteronomy, which are often seen as an attempt to kind of go back and rethink and re-summarize, but sometimes maybe even correct or rephrase or rethink even what the laws were earlier in the Torah. So let's take a look. If someone appears against another as a malicious witness, aid Hamas, a witness, a violent witness, a witness who wants to do violence, appears against another as a malicious witness and gives incriminating yet false testimony. Okay, la notbo Sarah says something that's clearly not true. The two men to the dispute shall stand, and you see what I'm doing, right? It's like bolded. At this point, we thought, oh, well, it's two men again. You know, I wouldn't have note two men is not a huge phrase, noticeable, but now I'm starting to pick up on, oh, interesting. Two men again to the dispute shall stand before the Eternal, before the priests or judges in authority at the time, and the judges shall make a thorough investigation. If the one who testified is a false witness, having testified falsely against a fellow Israelite, you shall do to the one as the one schemed to do to the other. Shall do to the one as the one schemed to do to the other. Kasher zamam lasot lachiv. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. Others will hear and be afraid, and such evil things will not again be done in your midst. Do not let your eyes show pity. And here we are again. Nefesh b'nefesh, ayin ba'ayin, shein b'shein, yad b'yad, regel b'regel. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Okay. Now, we've got our two men here, but it's a very different case, okay? They're not fighting, or they're not swinging fists, right? What situation are they in?
The lawsuit.
Yeah, they are fighting, actually.
Yeah.
They're in court fighting. Good. And in comes a witness and lies, and they catch the witness lying. And what's the punishment for the witness who's lying? Yeah. What you are testifying that the other person would have gotten a penalty, a death penalty, you're going to get it because you're falsely. Talk about a measure for measure, right? You didn't do it, but you're part of the spirit of, like the guy standing in the marketplace in Elisha's time. You're part of it. You did something that contributed or potentially contributed to a damage. It hasn't even happened yet, but you will now be punished in the same way. Now, I want you to think about, is that an eye for an eye? Is that a life for a life? Like, there's something different about that. Okay. And, but it has a similar principle of kind of just as you, so shall you. And then finally, do not let your eyes show pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Okay. So what's going to happen? What's this law here? What's going to happen? Two men are in court and they are fighting over, I don't know, a farm. Okay, so good. So Daisha's doing exactly the right kind of thinking after we've surveyed these three cases, which is, to try and look for common denominators here. What have we arrived at? What are the sorts of circumstances that might evoke the principle of an eye for an eye, whatever. And, we've now debated what that principle might mean, what's its utility, but there are certain variables, certain factors, and we could debate them, right? There was a debate here. Well, it seems like gender. You didn't think gender. How much is intentionality a part of it? We could debate the factors here, but it does seem like we're trying to gather a certain circumstance, certain set of cases to which the formula of an eye for an eye can be applied. But what I want to do in just these last minutes is to talk about the way that this last case, though it seems to fit the formula, because here there's an eye for an eye again, it is a very different circumstance, right? It's like, it is two men fighting. There's something similar about it, but they're fighting in court. They're fighting over something. Nobody's going to be cutting anyone's hand off. No one's going to kill the other one in court. They're trying to get each other's assets, right? What do you go to court for? Is you demand some sort of penalty in court. You don't demand that a person, or maybe I suppose you could have a person flogged, right? But there's a different kind of conversation happening that the judges are going to oversee. Nevertheless, in this case, there's still the principle that if you do something that is unjust, that you attempt to take the life, the tooth, the eye from somebody, then that same thing can be done to you. So there's an equivalency there, but it isn't exactly the same case. And I guess I want to think about then what we do with this law of an eye for an eye in a case like this. It's why are they mentioning an eye for an eye now when we don't see people actually fighting? There's no eye that's about to come out. So what's this last case here? It's
very different than the first case where the woman or whatever was what was the term? Collateral damage. A person lying in court is not an accident.
Yeah, right.
Oh.
Right. There's talk about intentionality.
It's not like they were fighting and they knocked over the stool and the woman or someone got their eye poked out or they got a wound or a bruise. Here, this is a person lying in a court.
Yeah.
Very different.
Entering into sort of like a civilized setting where people are working out their differences through the legal process, and yet someone is manipulating that. Someone is trying to get away from the legal procedure and to once again kind of savage someone by manipulating. Good. I think that you're exactly on the right track, and you're giving us the measure for measure principle earlier helps, because there is some notion that what is done should have some kind of response or reaction. But this is a different circumstance. We saw in the last case, there was already insertion of an idea that maybe you could pay a life for a life, but that was just for an animal, it wasn't for humans. But here, the human beings are negotiating their grievances in court. The way that this will be worked out is through a decision, through a payment, through a set of terms and penalties. And yet we still are working with this principle of, as you say, an eye for an eye, but it's almost less an eye for an eye and more like, just remember the principle of every action having a reaction. Some kind of measure for measure still applies. And these two men are going to have their disputes settled financially. And so what I want to suggest to you as we close is that there's these three cases get placed again and again in sort of similar but changing circumstances throughout the Torah, that eventually they're pushing us slowly towards an understanding of an eye for an eye, which ultimately can be worked out without gouging someone's eye out, but actually could be worked out in the court system, actually could be worked out financially. And that actually the rabbis are always the best readers, not just of the law of the Torah, but even of the literature of the Torah. And my sense is that they also had a feeling, not just for the crazy idea, what's a blind person? Even in the Torah's own rhythm, these cases start to be worked out through means other than physical direct revenge. And the last thing that I'll say, just to make, like, I'm making a claim, and so this is the point that I will use to try to prove it, is just look at the language of the last life for life. It's slightly different. It isn't ayin tachat ayin. It's not nefesh tachat nefesh. In Hebrew, for those of you who know Hebrew, it's a little different. It's nefesh b'nefesh, ayin ba'ayin, shein b'shein, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. I tried to make it clear in the English. It's not a life for a life, but life for life. Ayin tachat ayin literally means an eye in place of one other eye. Like you took out the eye and there you put another eye on top of it. That's literally what it means. But ayin ba'ayin is an eye for an eye. And that little shift in language makes it a less explicitly literal punishment. And even though the case is the same again, they're using the same language again, it's no longer that you all did tonight. So thank you so much for the learning.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight on Zoom and in person. And we hope you will join us at Rabbi Sharon Brous for the Minkoff lecture coming up in just a few weeks at Temple Solel.
She's a great speaker. If you've never heard her, she's one of the best.
And she just came out with a book. She'll be talking about that. And we also hope you'll join us at Dara Horn next month at Ort Zion for the Hammerman Family Lecture, and many other opportunities between now and then.
This guy brings you the best. I mean, we don't have speaker series like this in Los Angeles Jewish community. This is like, this guy brings you the best.
It's not me, it's actually these wonderful folks who do it. So
All right.
thank you so much for
Thanks,
being with us. Have a
everybody.
great night. Shabbat
Have a great
shalom.
night.